If you ache for truth, goodness, and beauty, if you're hungry for a Christianity with substance and strength, if you long for a faith that's big and bold and biblical and all about Jesus Christ, if you're inspired by the idea of one church that has spanned 20 centuries, 24 time zones, and 2 hemispheres, enfolding every race, nation, and language, then you're considering Catholicism.
I'm pretty excited to introduce all of you to Jacob. And Jacob, hopefully, is somebody you're all going to get to know a little bit better on the show this year, because I've found him to be such a thoughtful person who's walked through the path of considering Catholicism, the road to Rome, coming into the church, and having come in is a very thoughtful Catholic. And so I really have been wanting for a long time to introduce Jacob to all of you and have him be part of the conversation here. So I'm going to say, welcome, Jacob.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I met Jacob actually through RCIA. We were still calling it RCIA before the switch of acronym to OCIA. I had a phone call, an email or something to my office at the parish where I work, and it was this guy named Jacob, and he's interested in the Catholic Church, and he's interested in learning more about what might be involved in entering the Catholic Church. And so he came over, I think, one day, or I don't know, did we meet at a coffee shop? He came over to my office.
Yeah, that was a straight cold call to the church there. I called and just wanted someone to talk to.
Yeah, I think the first time we talked was on the phone or something, and then I think we had to sit down either at my office or we met at a coffee shop or something. But I remember from the first time that we sat down, Jacob started sharing why he was curious about Catholicism, the kind of road that he had been walking, not only spiritually, but intellectually, the kind of books that he was reading, the kind of people that he was talking to. He was in, I think, some book reading groups and things like that. And I found our conversations really rich and deep. And there were some points of intersection that both you and I had read some of the same books or had kind of, I think, worked through some of the same intellectual questions and things like that. So it was really fruitful. And I've been waiting for a really long time to share that with all of the listeners here at Considering Catholicism. So Jacob, welcome. And why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey?
Yeah, great. As you said, it all kind of started with that cold call to the church, just calling for someone to chat with about, all the questions that I had. And, by the time we chatted, I was well into a journey that had begun quite a few years ago, coming out of Protestantism, obviously. And it's almost difficult to jump into this whole thing because it is so big. It's like that Chesterton quote I always think of, I'm with the Catholic Church because it's true. That's why I believe it, which is such a big statement, but it's a deeply resonant statement as well. And my journey began just looking for the roots of the true church, and that turns out to be a very long thread that I would argue, it does lead to the doors of the Catholic Church.
That's such a great line. For those of you who maybe are not familiar with that, that was when G.K. Chesterton, who was one of the most well-known popular authors, and he was a magazine columnist, newspaper columnist in England around the time of if you were watch TV shows, Downton Abbey, like Edwardian England, he was super popular. And when he converted to Catholicism, it was a huge scandal because he was such a well-known public figure and leaving the Church of England. And so he wrote a very short essay called Why I Am Catholic, or Why I Became Catholic. And as you say, he starts by saying, if I were to list all of the reasons, there would be 10,000 reasons, but all of them boil down to simply one thing, which is that it's true. I've come to believe it's true. And so why don't you kind of tell us where that journey started? I mean, first of all, why don't you just give everybody a little bit of your background, a little bit about yourself, because one of the things that I think is so interesting is you're part of the same generation as Corey. I think you guys are about the same age. And most of our listeners are your age. I get demographics from Spotify and all that. And our average listener is like 30 to 35 years old. And, that's the center of the bell curve. We have people younger and people older. But there's a lot going on in your generation, I think, intellectually, culturally, spiritually. And I think that you are representative of some of that. So why don't you just introduce yourself to us in terms of who you are and where you come from and kind of what got you started on this journey?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, like I'm in that demographic, as you said, 34 years old, was raised in the church. Thankfully, my parents raised me in the church. And the denominations I was a part of back when I was younger ranged from Southern Baptist to evangelical to non-denominational. Thankful to be raised in the church. And I'm a software engineer professionally, so that's what I do for work. But, very passionate about reading about the church, studying scripture. Yeah, that's a quick snapshot.
And you're married?
Yes, married with 3 kids.
With 3 kids, and I think you said you have a 4th on the way.
4th is on the way.
Congratulations. One of the things that intrigued me about getting to know you is that software engineer is a pretty big umbrella, but you specifically work in AI and with an AI company. And so we're going to be doing some episodes coming up real soon about AI, and you're going to be real helpful in helping us to kind of unpack some of that. But what started you on the road of being curious about Catholicism? You mentioned going upstream to the original church, but I know there was more to it than just that. Well, maybe this. What made you think that going upstream would lead you to the Catholic Church?
Right. I had no definite sense of where I would arrive while setting out on this journey. I started digging into church documents going up to the Reformation. That's the first place that most people from the Protestant church are going to go. And there were a lot of richness there, but there didn't seem any good reason to stop at the 1500s, if that makes sense. You keep reading people and you go on. And I was just reading amazing things that were, moving me in really powerful ways. And it was really just one step at a time. And I would truly say that beauty was drawing me forward. Each bit that I was unpacking was such a true and genuine expression and a full expression of the faith that I felt I always carried. And it was little bits at a time that just started to break down that, I guess I could call it a wall of skepticism. Or, anybody who's raised in the Protestant church understands there's a bit of skepticism you have built in about Catholicism. It's almost as if you find bits of beauty, you can sort of accept them, in a sense, but you're also waiting for the deception to come. You're waiting for that moment. When am I going to be tricked? I don't want to go over the line here.
Well, the whole identity of Protestantism is right in the name, right? It's a protest. Its entire identity is framed around not being Catholic. I mean, we've talked about that on the show for years now, that it's hard to say exactly what a Protestant is, except that it's a Christian who is not a Roman Catholic and doesn't want to be. To some degree, that's how it self-identifies. But what's interesting, and I know that when you and I first started talking, because a lot of people who get to that place where they're like, I want to go upstream, I want to get back to the original church kind of thing, what they do is then they want to leap over 1,500 years before the Reformation. We've talked on the show about like this year zero problem. This is the evangelical thing of how do I get back to this kind of Christian primitivism of the first century. You end up with this kind of generic evangelicalism that supposedly replicates the first century church. But you didn't make that leap. You started figuring, okay, go back to 1517, and there had to be something in 1516 and 1515 and 1514, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it was completely linear, but, you do keep going back. And then through chats with friends who are theologically inclined and are interested in this type of thing, you start reading a little wider. And I found myself reading, okay, so I'm reading some Eastern Orthodoxy here. I'm reading some Catholic authors, and I very much so was in prayer throughout this whole time. I remember actually someone advising me to just pray a simple prayer. Holy Spirit, lead me into all truth. Very simple. And I did pray that very genuinely. Holy Spirit, please lead me into all truth. Don't let me go the wrong way. Don't let me, go into error here. And just guide my steps. And I feel like the Spirit certainly answered that. Every time I arrived at a truth that was new to me, or it was expressed in a way that I had not seen or heard before, I felt that it was affirmed via maybe 3 or 4 other paths the same week. It would just be immediately confirmed in such a strong way. It was just undeniable.
Well, what were some of those things that you were reading, or maybe what were some of those bullet list issues that you were working through, one by one?
Yeah, I would say it's more the sources I was reading than the issues I was working through. I didn't set out with a laundry list of questions. Well, I got to get the answers to these.
Interesting.
It was more so that the sources I was reading, they were so rich, and I could spitball. I'm reading St. Augustine. I'm reading St. John Henry Newman. I'm reading.
Well, you sat in my office one day and told me you were reading the Interior Castle.
Yes.
And I thought, man, that's like, that's jumping into the deep end of the pool in terms of Catholic mysticism. I mean, you talk about medieval Catholic mysticism. This isn't your typical evangelical who decides I'm going to dabble a little bit and read a little of Augustine and read some summaries of Aquinas and kind of dabble around. I mean, Teresa of Ávila and the Interior Castle is really, really jumping off the high dive into the deep end of the pool. And I think it was also interesting what you just said there, and I'd like to hear you talk more about that. A lot of people in their not conversion is not the right word, but right on the road to Rome, there's a list of issues they want to work through. They want to work through moral theology. I get emails every single day about they're working through the scripture stuff. I want to know about why the Catholic Old Testament has more books than the Protestant Old Testament. They want to work through why are priests celibate, and Protestant pastors aren't. I mean, whatever. Like, they've got this long laundry list of stuff, and then they sort of go fishing into the sources to answer their questions. You just started diving into reading all of the things that had happened between year 1 and 1517 and allowed all of that stuff to sort of bubble up from the bottom.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good description. I'm predisposed to going to source text, I suppose. I'm an English major, and I love literature. I love reading. I like going to source texts and sort of bathing in them and seeing where that leads me. And so, yes, St. Teresa, loved reading her. And I love reading philosophical texts. And I found that the mysticism played very well with some of the philosophers I was reading, somewhat more modern Catholic philosophers. Really, one of the incredible things that you'll see, anyone will see if you start reading Catholic literature is how well it speaks to its place in time and how well it contributes to philosophical conversation. This is one of the things I fell in love with, was this is a living church tradition. It's a living church tradition that's speaking to what's happening intellectually, in its current place in time. And I saw that the church was doing that.
That's such a great insight, but I want to hear you unpack it a little bit. I think that's a really, really, really fascinating insight, because you can go back in like every century, every era over the millennia, and see the great Catholic writers, the doctors of the church, the saints, addressing the contemporary issues of their day, right, and speaking to those. Yeah,
and sorry, it's jumping all over the place for me. As I said, it's something that was the conviction of what the church was. It was like something that was closing in on me from all sides, if that makes sense. But yeah, I mean, it was this real visceral sense of, we're in third millennia Christianity here, and the church is it's a living organism, and it's unpacking something that Newman has this quote in the Essays on the Development of Christian Doctrine, which was a big formative text for me, actually, at this point in my journey. Believe it or not, it sounds like something you get into later. What he talks about in that is largely about how doctrine develops. And for a Protestant, that's a real fascinating point to sort of, I guess, address up front, at least for someone like me, because as a Protestant, you think, well, most of what's true doctrinally is, it's what's the, line he uses, like the water is purer, closer to its source. So the further back you can go, the more true it is. And as time goes forward, you really can't trust new developments. You can't trust new thinking. The Protestant church is skeptical of that kind of thing. But Newman in that work specifically talks about, like the 7 criteria he has for what constitutes a genuine development, right? And he talks about truth as like this multifaceted gem that you look at, and it has different aspects, and it has so much dynamism to it that it can keep satisfying a mind that keeps looking at it from different angles.
I literally could not do this without you, because this show is 100% listener supported. There are no ads, no sponsors. So, if the episodes are helping you to understand the faith, to answer your questions, or draw you closer to historic Catholic Christianity, would you consider becoming a patron? For as little as $5 a month, you'll get every regular episode organized into topical playlists, plus exclusive bonus content, extra conversations, video Q&As, deep dives, live streams, behind the scenes, and more. Just head to patreon.com/considering Catholicism or tap the link in the show notes. Together, we're educating, equipping, and exciting people about the beauty of the Catholic faith.
I remember when I was on my road to Rome, I had a friend, another pastor, Protestant pastor, who tried to talk me out of it. It's like, like, what are you doing? Like, this is crazy. You're going to go become a papist or something like that, right? And he was trying to understand why. And I remember sitting there with him, grasping for some kind of a metaphor to explain it. And it was like, probably it's a lame metaphor, but what I came up with, it was like, imagine you're on this journey and you're going down this valley and it's arid and it's dry and there's this trail and, you're roughing it, you're camping in tents. And what you didn't realize is just over this ridge of mountains to your right, that if you climb the ridge of mountains, look over, there's a vast civilization and city over there. And like you've been roughing it along this pathway, dealing with kind of a really limited, primitive version of everything, when there was this rich, deep civilization, towns, cities, resources over there. And I thought, the deeper that I go, the more I read, the more I realize that there's this whole civilization full of resources and of depth that answer my questions. And it sounds like, I don't know if I'm not trying to impose my metaphor on you, but that's what I found, was that every time I read something or opened a door or started reading the saints or reading the doctors of the church or just reading church history, it was like, wow, I just keep opening more doors and more doors and more doors. And the further up and further in I go, the bigger it got.
It's very true. You're not putting those words in my mouth. It's certainly how I felt. And I think it's worth highlighting at this point, because I can sort of see the critique coming, maybe from someone who's a little more skeptical, that, okay, it's a tradition that has a lot of interesting philosophical writing, and maybe you do find it beautiful, but beauty is subjective. You're finding this beautiful, the built-in skepticism would say, people find things beautiful all the time that lead them into error, that lead them into dead-end paths. But it's truly a beauty that resonated with my deepest understanding of what was a genuine reflection or genuine expression of Christianity. You're taught as a Protestant to be skeptical of, writings that come from the Vatican, from the Pope. Why would you listen to the Pope? Who cares? We don't need him. We have the Bible. But crack open an encyclical like De Lexit Nos, like Dignitatis Humanae, any of these things, and you'll come across writing that is undeniable. And I would argue that the Holy Spirit will immediately confirm in the heart of someone who reads it in a genuine spirit. And when you experience that one bit at a time, the walls just start to come down. You cease to believe that the church is out to get you, and you start to see it as something that's holding something that's very, very beautiful and very powerful. And it is a true expression of the Christianity, like I said, that I've always believed for much of my life.
That comment that you made about how a Protestant skeptic will say that beauty can be subjective and thus deceptive, right? That really is kind of sawing off the branch that they're sitting on. Because if there isn't objective truth, not only objective factual truth, like 2 + 2 = 4 kind of stuff, but if there aren't things that are objectively good or objectively beautiful, right? If you don't have the the grounding and the transcendentals of truth and goodness and beauty, if those things aren't objectively real, then in a lot of ways the Protestant project falls apart. Because then what is the basis for them to direct me about how to interpret Scripture, for them to direct me how to worship? The same person who will say that to you, that, well, yeah, they can make a pretty building, the cathedrals are, nice architecture, but that's deceptive. I go, well, then what about your hymn book or your Protestant worship service or your praise and worship songs or whatever else you want to do? I mean, if everything is subjective, then why should I listen to you either? Either we're all grasping for some actual objective truth, the notion that whatever we get to, there's something behind it, or not. And I would actually say that inherent skepticism or subjectivity, maybe is the way to put it, that is in certain flavors of Protestantism is why the mainline Protestant denominations have now all conceded on things like same-sex marriage and everything else. Because once they conceded that there's not objective moral good, objective transcendent beauty, objective those things, those are all subjective preferences, then there's no intellectual firewall. So go to all of the mainline Protestant denominations and they've all gone liberal because there has to be that intellectual firewall. That's just my take, but.
Yeah. And that's another rabbit hole we could jump down.
There must have been along the way some issues that you had to work through in terms of, theological issues, philosophical issues, or whatever, those kinds of one-by-one things speed bumps you had to cross over. What were some of the major ones for you? I know for a while you dabbled in Calvinism, because that's one of the things you and I talked about. You were in some kind of a Calvinist book club or something like that. So maybe talk about, what some of those speed bumps were.
Yeah. I mean, I was never fully in the Calvinist circles. I was more so in the group, just participating with friends and people from church. But there was some good discussion there, but never was quite convinced. Yeah, it's a good question. I think some of the big things, like I mentioned, John Henry Newman really captured me. He has his famous metaphor of the fence, to keep the fence white, you got to keep painting it, right? Which is a very different sentiment than the Protestant has. It's like, to keep it pure, you leave it alone. You stop touching it. The more you touch it and poke it, the more you're going to bend it to your will or bend it to whatever, But he paints this picture of, if you really care for something and you really want to tend it and steward it well, you think about the parable of the talents, and steward it well, you're going to pay it attention and pay it mind and turn it over, like he says, like that gemstone that's capturing light from different angles. Turn it over. Keep turning it over. Like the picture of the church that's actively doing that was very, very compelling. And that initially drew me in to a position where I could trust what the church was, where I started to trust what the Catholic Church was in essence. I didn't have all of the fine points worked out. There's plenty of questions I had. Well, what about papal infallibility? What about Mary? What about this and that? All the classic questions that people want to ask. But the difference is I was standing on different ground. I could feel internally I was standing on different ground. I was standing on the ground of, I think this institution is reliable. I think Jesus is behind it. And if that's true, then I think I'm going to get these answers. I guess that was a fulcrum. It was a point where I felt it tipped the other way, if that makes sense. And yes, I did want to pursue that laundry list of things that I could go over that you've been over on this show. Many people have asked and people continue to ask. But I think seeing the development of doctrine and the church as developing it over time was the thing that tipped me over to a place where I was much more open.
See, I think you're getting at a really important point there, Jacob, because when you go through that laundry list of issues, when you listen to the Protestant YouTube apologists, the kind of the rhetorical tactic is to take any of those issues, what about Mary? What about this? What about that? and then force the Catholic to justify those positions based on Protestant premises. Mm-hmm. So basically show that there's a way to frame all of them. The way that you can prove Catholic points is by showing that they're Protestant enough to meet their criteria. Mm-hmm. And I think what you're saying is really interesting, because when you look at Newman and he talks about the organic growth of doctrine, then you're not starting from this Protestant premise. You're saying, look, Christ gave the apostles the good deposit. And it was a good deposit. It was a seed. It was seed corn. And that was seed corn naturally grew over time. Some of our listeners may not be familiar with Newman, but just a couple of you talked about the fence, which is a great analogy he uses. But the basic idea, just let me say this for those who maybe aren't familiar, is that living things grow. So if you take an acorn and you go stick it in the ground, it grows into an oak tree.
Yep.
And the oak tree, as time goes on, doesn't look much like an acorn anymore, but it is the same acorn. I mean, genetically, it's the same entity, and everything that comes out of that acorn is consistent with the acorn. And the same thing with a child. Human being, right, at conception doesn't look like a 34-year-old grown man, but the 34-year-old grown man is the same being that fetus was. And so the thing is living things grow. And that was, I think, Newman's point. And to your point, once you go back and you accept that kind of premise that Christ mm-hmm. gave the apostles the good deposit, and then and then promised that he would be with his church till the end of the age, then every one of those kind of laundry list issues, you can go back and see how to the degree that they grew, they weren't invented, they naturally grew out of that good deposit. I mean, here I'm putting words in your mouth, but
oh, absolutely. That's perfect. Yeah. And I think, it was an important starting point for me because, like I said, it puts you on positive ground. I think that you can find whatever your argument you're looking for, depending on your, where you're starting from or what your disposition is. But Protestantism has this attitude of, Catholic Church, you justify all your additions, whereas it shifted for me. I'm like, don't you have to justify the subtractions? Why did you subtract this? This was here.
Exactly.
Orthodoxy, Eastern Orthodoxy still has it. Catholicism still has it. You subtracted it. Why did you subtract it?
Well, the other thing too, right, is when you listen to the Protestant apologists, they make Rome a boogeyman. So they like to do that. The papists, the popery, Rome, the Roman Pope. And that's why I'm on the show a lot. I just talk about the ancient churches, because it's not just Rome, right? I mean, all these things, look at the Eastern Orthodox, look at the Egyptian Copts, look at the Syrian Antioch Church, look at the Maronites, look at the Syro-Malabar Church in India founded by Thomas, right? All of the ancient churches that trace their roots back to the first century contain all of these ideas and these doctrines. And when you frame it that way, then you go, why is there this one narrow subset of Christians that have subtracted all of those? This isn't something that the Pope in Rome forced on anybody. This is something that in 1517, a small group of schismatics decided to pull out of.
And, just to fast forward a little bit, yes. So after that point, I of course, dove into all the issues that you want to know about. Okay, so what is the deal with Mary? Why so much veneration? How does the church see the Pope and all these things? And for me, there are very, very strong typological arguments for these questions, right? There are great answers to be had. But I don't believe in my heart that most people are won over by like the best argument that corners them. People don't like being cornered, and we shouldn't corner people. I was drawn in by the beauty. I was drawn in by the vision of a church that's holding something true and trying to steward it well. And once I saw the church through that lens, it was all downhill to a certain degree.
There's a limitation to how far you can go with, as you say, kind of arguing people into the faith. You can, like you say, you can corner people. You can get people to admit that they're wrong, But cornering them and getting them to admit that you've beaten them in an argument is not the same as winning their heart and making them love the church. And for that, that's where you kind of go back to those three transcendentals and the paths. There's the path of truth. Some people are going to be more intellectually oriented, and they, you find any bit of truth and you latch onto it and you follow it to its source, and it's going to lead you back. If you've moral goodness, the number of people that have ended up Catholic because of simply, being attracted by moral goodness. When I was younger, when I was your age, it was, St. Teresa of Calcutta, right? Mother Teresa of Calcutta, and it was like, well, look at Mother Teresa of Calcutta, but you could look at 10,000 examples like that and say, hey, moral goodness is compelling. And for you, like you say, beauty. A lot of it is, I've talked on the show a lot before about, for me, it was visiting some of those ancient sites when I was a Protestant and I'd travel to Europe, and I would go to these places. I'd go to these medieval abbeys and things like that, and I would just walk around them and wonder who built this and why. And that puts a hook in your soul. And then you begin to intellectually investigate to answer your questions, but the hook is in your heart at that point. Something has to be compelling and beautiful and good, not just, you haven't just won an argument with somebody about something. Winning the argument's relatively easy, but that doesn't win anybody's heart or loyalty or faith.
And I think one thing I'll say is that throughout my life as a Protestant, I had those moments of beauty, many, many moments of beauty. There's more. If you find the faith beautiful and you know that there's more around the bend, why wouldn't you go to see it?
Right on. Well, I'll tell you what, we're going to stop here. This is going to be a 2-part conversation. And when we start up again, we're going to talk about crossing the final bridge, on the road to Rome, kind of going over the Tiber, what that was like, how you made that decision, to pull the trigger, and what coming into the church was like, and what it's been like as a new Catholic. Okay? So,
great.
All right. Thanks, Jacob. All of you out there, listen to part 2 with Jacob. It'll air a couple days after this. And thanks for listening, and keep considering Catholicism. We'll be back with another episode very soon. And this show is 100% listener supported. My patrons keep the lights on, and they let me spend more time researching and recording so that these episodes keep coming. If this show has helped you, would you consider becoming a patron? For as little as $5 a month, you'll get every regular episode organized into topical playlists, plus exclusive bonus content, extra video Q&As, deep dive courses, live streams, and more. Just head to patreon.com/considering Catholicism or tap the link in the show notes. And would you please rate the podcast on whatever platform you're using, and write a review on Apple Podcasts or on consideringcatholicism.com. And you can drop me a line. Patrons can comment directly on Patreon posts or Spotify. I read every one. Or you can always use the contact form at consideringcatholicism.com, or you can email me at consideringcatholicism@gmail.com. I love hearing your questions, your comments, and your stories.